Hi church, thank you for joining us. It's great to be with you again. The title of today's message is 5 Obstacles Between Paul and Rome. Now if you've been following this series that I've been doing in the past week, you will remember that I've been looking at the fact that Paul knew that he had to go to Rome. Now remember, Rome was in a sense like the centre of the world at that time under the Roman Empire, and Paul knew that he had to go to Rome to preach the gospel, and God had revealed that to him. However, between Paul receiving that revelation, that promise that he needed to go to Rome, and between the promise actually being fulfilled, Paul seemed to come up he seemed to come up against so many obstacles. We already looked at the fact that he ended up in prison in Jerusalem. We looked at the fact that there were more than 40 Jewish men who made a conspiracy or a plot to kill Paul, and they even took an oath not to eat or drink until they'd killed him. Then we looked at the fact as well that Paul was shipwrecked on his way to Rome, and he ended up in the island of Malta. And then when he was in Malta, there was a serpent or a snake or a viper that wrapped itself round Paul's hand. It was just one thing after another between the promise being given to Paul and Paul actually getting to Rome. But there's one other obstacle that I've not spoken about yet that Paul came up against. When you see Acts chapter 21, that's when Paul arrived in Jerusalem before he went to prison, and Paul went to the temple, and when he was in the temple, false accusations were made against him, and Paul was dragged away from the temple. He was beaten up, and the rioters who were against him tried to kill him. Just imagine that. He was in physical agony. He was coming against false accusations, and he was eventually placed in the barracks. It was one obstacle after another that Paul came up against. He was beaten up, put in the barracks, he was put in prison. He experienced plots and conspiracy against him to kill him. He also was shipwrecked, and when he ended up on the island of Malta, a serpent or a viper wrapped itself round his hand. Church, remember, there are so many obstacles often between the promise being given and the promise being filled. So I encourage you to keep your eyes on Jesus, to stay focused, to persevere, and he will fulfill the purposes, the plans for our lives, and the words that he has spoken to us. God bless you. Hello church, well welcome to Wednesday evening with Full Gospel Church. Now this evening I'm not going to share a long message or give a long preach. All I want to do is simply to remind us that during this past week on different occasions we have looked at the life of the Apostle Paul and how he knew he had to get to Rome, and yet there were so many obstacles that came against him. And in your life and in my life, it's going to be the same, and for the life of the church as well. So rather than talk, what I would like us to do this evening is, once this video is finished, I would encourage us in our homes, either as individuals or as married couples, to come back to the promises that God has spoken to us, to come back to the prophetic words that God has given us. You might have them written down, you might have them recorded, and I would encourage you to listen to them, or to read them, to think about them, and then to pray into them. But you know, it's so important that we don't forget the promises that God has spoken over our lives. Now, we've not to try and outwork the promise. It is God who brings the promise to fulfillment. All we have got to do is walk in obedience to God's written word, the Bible, and he will bring to pass the prophetic words that have been spoken into our lives. But I think it would be really good during this lockdown if we could come back to all the promises, all the prophecies that have been spoken into our lives, and just bring them before the Lord afresh and pray into them. It says in Acts chapter 19, Paul said that he knew he had to go to Rome, but then a couple of chapters later, when he was in Jerusalem, he was in prison, and the Lord came and told him that he had to testify about him in Rome. And then in Acts chapter 27, during the storm on the boat or the ship, remember, an angel of the Lord came and told Paul again that he would have to testify to Caesar in Rome. It was just an example of even the great man of God, the Apostle Paul. He was reminded and reminded of where God was taking him. So let's do that, church. Let's set aside some time now and pray into the prophecies and the promises that God has given us. Have a great evening, and thank you for joining us and praying with us.